I think that people should commit themselves in their own personal lives to treating people without regard to race, to the best of your ability. We should demand public policy not be based on race, but rather based on class. You're taught to admire basically rappers and basketball players. It's considered normal to listen to the lifestyle of the hardest rappers as something to aspire to, rather than just as a good song to listen to. Black Americans in particular, having not come here by choice, many of them don't share that immigrant mentality. It's kind of like an I'm owed something mentality. In political conversations, most people don't say what's true, they say what benefits them. I think that Israel had to go in after October 7th and get rid of Hamas.
Do you believe that Marxist socialism is an ally for blacks or not?
Oh, no, not at all. I mean, there's...
Criticized by creating.
So, Coleman, thanks for joining me today. It's an honor to have you.
Thanks for having me.
You're most welcome. So, Coleman, we're definitely going to be talking a lot about what you discuss on your book here, the end of race politics. But before we go there, I just wanted to see if you could spend a little bit of time telling us more about you, because I think when you understand where someone is coming from, it helps you understand where they are today and where they're heading to. So, who is Coleman Hughes?
So I grew up in Montclair, New Jersey, which is a racially diverse and very liberal town right outside of New York City. Mm-hmm. And I grew up with friends of every race, and I didn't really think of them as belonging to a particular race. So, people where I grew up had the default Martin Luther King ethic of not judging people based on their race, but rather based on the content of their character. And I thought that that was the right way to approach things growing up. And I lived my life. I was primarily, I was a good student. I had friends, and really music was my passion. I was really a jazz musician throughout high school and traveled all around the world doing that. And when I was 16, I was sent to something called the People of Color Conference, which is a conference that my high school sent me to, where this was the first time in my life where I had encountered the philosophy which says that actually race is not nothing. Race is not meaningless. Race is everything. And if you are anything but white, if you're Black, Hispanic, if you're Asian, then your race is a kind of magic inside of you, and it makes you special, and it makes you better. And if you're white, then your race is something that you should be ashamed of. It's something that makes you part of the oppressor class, something that makes you privileged. And so I went to this conference. It was only a two or 3 day conference. Went back home and assumed I would never really encounter that sort of philosophy again. It was kind of like visiting the Amish or something. It was like, oh, that's interesting. Okay, back to real life. But then I went to Columbia University in 2015, and it turns out that philosophy was pretty deeply entrenched. So in orientation week, they had you go to different corners of the room in one exercise based on your race, and then talk about how you either participated in or suffered from systemic oppression. And all the kids participating in this exercise were among the most privileged, kids pretty much on planet Earth, in the sense that we're at an Ivy League school. Most of us come from situations of socioeconomic privilege and so forth. And the effect of it was to make me feel much more acutely aware of my race. I was being put essentially in the victim bucket by this exercise, whether or not I wanted to be seen that way. And that's when I became interested in writing about this issue of race, because I was genuinely curious what was going on around me at campus. What was going on in a situation where there was almost no actual racism against Black students, but you had kids writing in the newspaper every single day that they experience white supremacy on campus all the time. I became curious about what is causing this. And that's when I started writing about this issue. And eventually that became the book I published a few months ago.
Mm. Yeah, the way you explained it in the book, that whole episode of discovering for the first time, that people were being separated along race lines, that was very, it definitely left a mark on me for sure. Now, Coleman, when you say race is meaningless, let's take a little devil's advocate there. Does race really not mean anything? Are you saying race is meaningless as if it's not still part of a person, even if it's the envelope? Is it what you're saying when you say it's meaningless? Do you really truly mean it's meaningless?
I mean it's meaningless in the sense that for most of us, most of the time, it should be meaningless. It I don't see why it should be more significant in most situations than your hair color or your eye color, in the sense that your race, it doesn't tell me anything about who you are. It doesn't tell me if you are kind or if you're angry. It doesn't tell me if you're smart or you're an idiot. It doesn't tell me if you're right or if you're wrong. So what does it tell me? I mean, it may give me some probabilistic information about where you come from. But the moment I actually want to know where you come from, I'm just going to ask you. I'm instantly going to ask you as an individual, hey, where are you from? What's your story? And the second you get into that answer, I already know more about you than I would have had I judged you simply on the basis of your race. So that's what I mean when I say that race is insignificant.
Wonderful. And how do you think, and what do you think happened? How did we get there? What happened in your mind?
Yeah. So what happened is in the 1970s and 80s, you had a few intellectual movements, primarily critical race theory. This was a movement among academics in law schools. And their basic philosophy was that white supremacy is everywhere. The civil rights movement didn't go far enough. White supremacy is built into the very foundations of every institution in the country. And so you have to destroy all the institutions and rebuild them from the ashes in order to actually fight racism. You can't fight it from within the system. You have to destroy the system. This was very marginal for decades. You'd only encounter it if you were an academic or graduate student at particular places. But then, starting in 2013, something changed, which is that everyone got smartphone-enabled cameras and social media. And once that happened, it fundamentally changed the way information spread. Before 2013, say like in 2005, if there was a white police officer arresting a black suspect and they got into a fight and the policeman killed the black suspect somewhere in say Topeka, Kansas, the way you would learn about that is it would be in the newspaper, the local newspaper the next day. A journalist would ask the family questions, ask the police questions. Maybe it's on the local news. And me living in New Jersey, I'd never know about it. And the same is true, by the way, if it was a white person that was killed by the cops. After 2013, that fundamentally changes. What happens is now everyone's got a smartphone, everyone's on social media. If that same arrest goes down, what happens is someone starts filming it probably halfway through so that they're missing the beginning of the interaction. They upload it to Facebook where it gets millions of views in a matter of hours with no journalistic context or fact checking. And then it gets put through a social media algorithm that intentionally feeds you content that is going to upset you the most. And it doesn't feed you content that actually educates you or gives you context, because that doesn't get engagement, that doesn't get clicks, and that doesn't get dollars from advertisers. So once you filter all this information through that new system of social media and smartphones, we start to get a moral panic that white supremacy is on the rise, that it's open season on the police killing Black people. None of this was true. It only seemed true because of the way social media distorted information. But once people started believing that, they became way more open and interested in these ideas from critical race theory that had been percolating at the margins of academia for a long time. Ideas like white privilege, systemic racism, and so forth. And so that's when you begin to see, and I have a chapter in my book about this, you begin to see the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, legacy media in general, mentions of racism, white supremacy, systemic racism, white privilege, all of that skyrockets starting in 2013. And that's where we get to the point where it becomes, especially among kids and younger people, it becomes the cool thing is to say, actually, race is super meaningful, and to get into all of this toxic race thinking.
Got it. Yeah, no, that graph was very telling, very telling. I think it's one of the graphs that I remember the most from the book. So Coleman, what's the path forward? I mean, is there a path forward in your mind? And of course I read your book and I know what you, but I want you to share with, is there a path forward?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there is a couple different prongs to this. One is just the personal. I think that people should commit themselves in their own personal lives to treating people without regard to race, to the best of your ability. So that's the personal aspect. Everyone can check in with themselves and essentially hold themselves to account to see if you are acting in accordance with the philosophy, the broadly colorblind philosophy. Path forward at the policy level is that we should demand public policy not be based on race, but rather based on class. That is, public policy, those public policies that are meant to help the disadvantaged, they should be executed on the basis of income, wealth, or some combination measure, some better proxy for disadvantage than race. Mm-hmm. Another public policy path forward is that we have to focus on the real problem, right? So many of the controversies about race in public policy have to do with these policies that only kick in for adults. Affirmative action in college admissions is relevant to 17, 18-year-olds. Diversity, equity, and inclusion programs in corporate America are largely relevant to people 22 and older. All of these policies are not aimed at the real source of the problem, which is the disadvantage that, in particular, poor kids, whether they be white or Black or Hispanic or Asian, the disadvantage that poor kids living in intergenerational poverty in communities where there's lots of crime, the disadvantage they experience between the ages of 0 and 18 is really the crux of the problem and the area where the state should be focusing on. And I talk about in the book one of the studies which paints part of the path forward by Roland Fryer, where he was able to take over about a dozen of the lowest performing public schools in Houston and fired half the teachers, replaced the principals, extended the school day, did more testing, all these kind of interventions that are kind of impossible because of unions, public sector unions. and was able to raise test scores across the board in a very impressive way, with precisely the students that the system is generally failing. And so that has to be the focus, and that can be done on the rationale of class and socioeconomics, not on the rationale of race. And then finally, I think we just have to commit to raising each generation of kids to believe in Martin Luther King and Martin Luther King's philosophy around race, that they are going to be judged by the content of their character, not by the color of their skin, and that they should extend the same courtesy to everyone else. I think most kids naturally resonate with this ethic when they hear it, because it actually lines up with how children generally think. Children, I'm not someone that thinks that children are perfect and are corrupted by society. Children are often selfish, for instance. They have to be taught to share often. Depends on the kid, of course. But one thing children are not, one problem they do not have, is racism. They generally do not invest race with any significance by default, unless they are taught to by society. Mm-hmm. They're obviously interested, kids are interested in, oh, mommy, he has dark skin, she has light skin. Those kinds of, they notice it in that sense, but they don't ascribe any deeper meaning to it. Mm-hmm. And so each new generation of children is an opportunity to re-enshrine the colorblind ethos in the next generation, and at minimum to not poison their minds with adult racial toxicity and race thinking.
That's great. And so going back to the 0 to 18 place, reading your book and looking at the solutions part, you just shared some of them here. I could not help but notice that it seems like you were putting a lot of emphasis on charter schools, which is great. And then my question for that was, Coleman, do you believe that, is it charter schools only, and or do you believe in the more, bigger scheme of school choice in general? And within school choice, what's your take on religious schools, especially for for Black kids? Do you have a take on that specifically, or not?
I haven't thought much about religious schools, but I do know that there are a lot of really good religious schools, and there are even parents that send their kids to religious schools even though they're not religious, just because some of them are very good. And one of the to focus on charter schools for a second, one of the things Roland Fryer found is that there are good charter schools and there are bad charter schools. If you look at the good ones and you ask the question, what are they doing right? One of the things they do right is that they have very high expectations. They have cultures of excellence. They're strict. In some cases, they have a tough love approach. And they take this approach even with kids from single parent homes, low socioeconomic backgrounds. They expect you to show up to class and show up on time, or else there's consequences, this kind of thing. And they expect kids to apply to colleges. They expect, they do not lower their expectations of kids as a result of their backgrounds. Mm-hmm. Roland Fryer found that when importing charter practices into public schools in Houston, that this was a crucial aspect of his success. And so I think one reason I've heard people like religious schools is because of that aspect, because some of them, the good ones, have that aspect of discipline and high expectations. That is not really a given in every public school. Now, in general, I'm definitely pro school choice. It kind of baffles me that Democrats are against it, because it's so clearly an issue where, first of all, rich people already have school choice, right? Not only because they can pick which neighborhood to live in, they can pick the neighborhood with the high property taxes and the better schools, and they often move to districts because of the school, and they have the means to do that because they have money. But they can also just opt out of the public school system entirely if it's terrible and send their kid to a private school.
Good.
Poor families don't have that option. So to be against school choice is essentially to say to poor Americans, tough. Sorry. I know you want the best for your kid, but you're going to the public school in the place that you live. I know it's rough for you to move. You probably can't move to a better place with a better school district because you don't have the means to. But look, the public school in your district has had a 60% graduation rate for 30 years. And, 10% of the kids end up doing jail time. But so what? That's your only option. I mean, it's insane to me that this would be the message from at least the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, if not the Democratic Party in general. And especially when you have the better charter schools literally have wait lists in the tens of thousands for families that want to get into these schools. So I'm certainly pro school choice without saying that every charter school is good, because there are some bad ones as well.
Of course. And then moving on to the older population, that was on the 0 to 18 in terms of what would be your favorite solution. Let's talk about the adults a little bit. And so I guess the way we would talk about it, and I hate these words, but you would be an African American the way I guess it's talked about, and I would be an African immigrant. So it is my perception that African immigrants usually tend to perceive the US as a land of opportunity. I certainly do. And it's also my perception that it seems like Black Americans, African Americans, those who call themselves African, descendants of slaves, they don't seem to see this nation as a land of opportunity. Is that your take as well? Is that your perception as well? And if it is, why do you think that is?
Yeah, so I think immigrants in general, because they are by definition the people that choose to come here, they do view it as a land of opportunity, or else they probably wouldn't come, right? And so immigrants in general often have an immigrant mentality, which is, I'm going to America because you can succeed there. You can live there. The government won't bother you, or if you're able to get employment and get an education, you can break into the upper middle class. You can be from a village in Africa or India and come here, and if you have the right skill set and the right drive, you can literally make it into the upper middle class and send your kids to Harvard in a generation, which is crazy. Most places in the world, many places, and certainly almost the whole world used to be like this. There's just, codes and castes and classes and barriers that may be legal or social that prevent you from that kind of upward mobility. But America is premised on a different idea, and however imperfectly, it actually attracts immigrants from all around the world because the ideal is true. It's possible, the American dream here. Black Americans in particular, having not come here by choice, I think that many of them don't share that immigrant mentality. And in fact, there's a kind of an opposite mentality. There's kind of like an I'm owed something mentality. That's not true of all Black Americans. It may not even be true of most Black Americans, but it's definitely, it's an interesting comparison case, because whatever level of racism there is in America, it's going to be experienced both by Black Americans and by African immigrants. Yet, though that is held equal between both groups, the mentality, the striving mentality, is not necessarily held equal among both groups. And so you can end up with very different outcomes, different cultures even, and different results as a result of that mentality difference.
And similarly, going back to when we were talking about the Democrats earlier, and you being appalled at their resistance to school choice in general, I have the same, wonders as to why that is the case. But it is, again, my perception that both African immigrants and Black Americans tend to be more on the conservative side. So, do you feel that, and if you have the same perception, do you believe that the Democrats in general pushing for a very aggressive, progressive agendas, it might get to the point where there's a break, between the Black constituency?
Hmm.
And I was very offended when someone like Biden said, if you're even thinking about voting for me or not, you're not being Black. Just that level of being taken for
Mhm.
granted as to how we should be thinking or where we should be siding. Do you think that eventually at some point there's going to be a break of some kind?
Yeah, it's a good question. There has been a lot of polling recently suggesting that younger Black Americans are moving towards the Republican Party, not in huge numbers, but kind of bit by bit. You saw uh, Trump got more of the Black vote in 2020 than he did in 2016. And it looks like there is a trend among younger Black Americans, though, mainly among like Black men under 30, moving towards the Republican Party. Um, I don't know how big the trend is. I don't think it's going to be big enough to, to move Black Americans as a whole, but it's definitely a worrisome trend for Democrats, and it certainly has something to do with how they talk and conceive of the issue of race. That turns a segment of Black Americans off. And you're right to point out. I mean, I remember. I think last time I looked, it was something like almost 40% of Black Americans identify as conservative, and most of those people vote Democrat. But ideologically, they don't like progressive policies, and Black Americans are the most conservative sort of voting bloc, if you will, of the Democratic Party. Meaning, Black Americans are much more conservative. Black Democrats are more conservative than white Democrats on most issues, social issues, religious issues, you name it. So, there is this way in which people often speak for the Black community, and the people doing that on cable news, on TV, in op-eds are pretty much down to the one. They are like progressive. They tend to be progressive overwhelmingly, but they often don't really represent the views of the community as a whole.
That's right. And this other question I'm very interested in hearing your thoughts on is, do you think that African American studies at universities are part of a solution or part of a problem?
I think in practice, African American studies programs they have good aspects. They have a lot of good classes. They're also like hotbeds of activism and slanted scholarship too. So, it was controversial in the beginning when they first introduced them, because I think it was Bayard Rustin who argued, and probably others, why would you section off African American studies from American studies in general, right? But I think in practice, what happens when you do that is it becomes about advocacy rather than scholarship. And so you'll see in African American studies programs, it's like, to what extent do they even study Black conservative thought at all? Almost not at all, which is what you would do if you were trying to introduce students to a diverse range of opinion. But if you're trying to indoctrinate them into a particular philosophy, then that's what it's also what gender studies has become, and so forth. So I'm not against the concept of African American studies if it were balanced. which it's
Interesting.
not currently.
Along the same veins, you know, it's when I first came to America for the first time that I had to sit there and think about, which box do I check? And at least for me, in my case, it's easy, right? I mean, both my parents are, Black Africans. Both my parents had the same last name, even to start with. They were not from the same tribe, but even then, they had the same last
Hmm.
name. So I
Wow.
guess, okay, are you Black? Are you Caucasian? Whatever. It's easy for me to check. But I had some of my friends who were like, "Which am I?" Friends like mine, like you, or like you, who would be like, "Wait, I'm half half. I don't identify with either." Do you feel so coming from a country, first my family immigrated to Europe, Germany, and then France, and then after business school in France I moved to the US. So it's when I first came to the US that I ever had to answer such a question on any piece of paper. And I have to say, looking at what's going on in France, what's going on here, I have always been asking and wondering, is it better to track um, for race really or not? Because in France, they're not. Here, of course, they are. And I'm interested in your views on that. Is it better not to, or somewhere in between, or should it be done in a different way?
Hmm.
And is it helping? Is it helping at all with
There's- hmm. Yeah, it's a good question. You know, I don't know how much it actually matters. That's the truth. Because at the end of the day, whether or not you check the box is one thing, but um, what's really the crux of the issue is like, how does the culture feel about the race issue? You know, in France, they don't check the box, but they may end up. I mean, they had riots recently, last year, and so forth, very much along racial lines. Although that was the Arab community, if I recall. Um, I mean, and you could argue checking the box is the first step to all of these race-based policies, right? And if you never check the box to begin with, you never get these race-based policies. So to that extent, I see the argument for just not even checking the box. On the other hand, a lot of these issues are primarily cultural, and tough to influence by, like, for example, if America stopped checking the box, if we just stopped having that, stopped collecting that information, I don't know. I wonder how much would change.
That's an interesting. And staying on the issue of culture, what's your take on urban Black culture, and does it matter or not? I have this conversation oftentimes with my Black American friends. And so, do you believe that urban Black culture matters?
What do you mean by
Matters as
matters?
in, insofar as you have so many Black Americans who, going back to the perception we're talking about earlier, don't, I did not choose to come here. This country is not, um, welcoming to me as things are. Do you, and also when we were talking about the success level for, Black Americans, what I mean by Black culture matters means if you have a certain culture, it definitely will impact whatever output you can expect and want to have. So I'm speaking about it from that standpoint.
Mhm.
When you go back to I think it was a few years ago, 3, 4 years ago, Smithsonian Institute. I don't know if you remember that exhibit where they had it on.
Mhm.
To be on time is to be white. Delayed gratification is
Mhm.
to be white. So what I mean by does urban Black culture, which seems to have certain, values that you and I know
Mhm.
don't always play out well if you want to be
Yeah.
a successful person on the other end. So it's the standpoint from which I speak. And that oftentimes when we bring it up, the Democrats especially tends to want to categorize you as some type of right wing. just simply for us wanting to expect the best from our fellow, men and women. So that's what I meant by does urban Black culture matters. Do you think it's playing it's causing trouble or not?
Oh yeah, of course. I mean, it's a huge problem. If you grow up in a subculture where nobody has a father, where it's considered normal to enter a life of criminal activity, um, where you're more likely to know people that go to prison than people that go to college, where you're taught to look up, you're taught to admire um, basically rappers and basketball players, and you're taught to, uh, or let's say, I wouldn't say you're taught to, but it's considered normal to listen to the lifestyle of the hardest rappers as something to aspire to, rather than just as a good song to listen to, but actually as a lifestyle to chase. Um, a lifestyle that doesn't believe in delayed gratification, believes if I have money today, I need to spend it today. That believes in ostentatious displays of wealth. If I get a little money, I need to buy grills, I need to buy a watch, I need to buy a chain, and show everybody how well I'm doing. That you need to respond to any insult to your ego with a willingness to fight whoever just insulted you, and to be quick to violence, to treat women terribly. Um, if you're raised in all, if you're raised in a situation where all of that stuff is considered normal, you are at a huge disadvantage relative to someone that was raised like me, or raised in any more kind of functional subculture where, you're taught to follow through on commitments, save money, think about the long term, um, never consider abandoning your children. All this stuff. You're taught that crime is highly stigmatized, and completely abnormal. You're at a huge disadvantage if you're raised in that subculture, and no matter what color you are, by the way. But disproportionately, the people in America who are raised in that kind of ghetto culture is Black Americans, and to a lesser extent,
Yeah.
Hispanic Americans. But there are white Americans too. So it absolutely
that.
matters. It's huge.
To build on that, then why do you think that Black Americans, and I see it sometimes, African immigrants who have had the, the luck of being raised in more functional families and backgrounds, as you were describing earlier, why do you think that in place in people like that sometimes, oftentimes, not sometimes, oftentimes, right now, decide to side with even rejecting the criticism that some of us might have on this urban Black culture when we're saying it matters, this needs to be fixed? Why do you see them siding and almost acting like there's nothing wrong with that? If you go down that terrain, you're basically being a racist if you're white, and you're being a coconut head if you're Black. Like that's what I get called, coconut head. You're just being a speaking head for right wing people. You're just playing in their hand. Why are we going for this when we know better? We have benefited from better. We know better. What do you think makes us stay there? And what is it? Because I'm killing myself trying to understand.
I think it's yeah. Um, I think it's largely cowardice, because if you really think about it, most people in political conversations, most people don't say what's true. They say what benefits them, because at the end of the day, what they say around the dinner table or at the office is probably not going to affect the state of the world very much, but it might affect the state of their life. So if they say something that you're not supposed to say, it could affect them a lot. It could affect their prospects at work. They could pay a price, a social price, because people are going to call them Uncle Tom or Coconut Head, and nobody wants that. And so I think most people, when faced with a simple decision of like recognizing an obvious reality and speaking about it honestly, versus and paying a price for doing so, versus going along to get along, just saying what you're supposed to say in order to preserve, in order to not pay a price. I think most people choose the latter in that situation. And it's not really rocket science. It's just self-interest.
And I could totally see that, Coleman. But then I go back to the way, and by the way, you were so wonderful. I wanted to reach out and give you a hug for being so patient and so calm during the View, interview, when they were all ganging up on you unnecessarily. If we go back to what you just said, what does Whoopi Goldberg have to lose by now? And especially in her case, her stance does matter. It's not just, so what does she have to lose, to go back to what you were saying? If I was to take that, I think I agree with you for some circumstances, but in circumstances like this, where you have this woman who should right now try to think about her legacy, what she's leaving behind. Is she helping, Black people going forward, get ahead or not? What does she have to lose, number one? And number two, when I don't know if it was her or the other gal, when they asked you, when they had the nerves to say that you were just being a talking head, like this tool for white right wingers. I get that a lot as well. What are they saying? Are they saying that they don't believe that we can have true agency? I'm just trying to understand it. Do you think it's again what you were saying? They'd say whatever it takes to stay relevant, if they think right now the relevancy is on the other side, or do you believe that maybe there's something deeper there that has sprung up? Maybe because if you spend your whole life talking nonsense, at some point you become nonsense, and you even believe it's true. So I don't know. I'm very confused because I hear this and I can't help. I don't know for you that's the same. But whenever a Black person tells another Black person, you thinking this way is playing in the hand of XXX, you're right there saying that X is supreme. You're going for supremacy here of the X over me. So what's your take on this? Because
yeah, no, that's right. I mean, I think, yeah, it in a way it is kind of, it is sort of ironic because you're saying that like white people are powerful enough to control what this guy is saying and thinking, essentially. And he couldn't possibly be thinking it for himself, or thinking it because he really believes it. As for the first question, what does Whoopi have to lose? Someone like her, who's obviously wealthy and famous and, loved by a lot of people. I think people always have to lose. In America, you can lose your Black card at any level of wealth, and actually, human beings care a lot, as much about social approval and community belonging as we do about wealth. So even someone who's a multimillionaire can still be kind of like emotionally and psychologically wounded if she gets shunned by prominent members of her community. And I think that's too much for some people to handle.
That's rather sad to hear, because then I'm wondering, what are we left with? Hopefully we have people like you. When it comes to Black Lives Matter, and I know they've been fading a little bit, hopefully. I don't know, maybe you don't think it's hopefully. But Black Lives Matter, the organization, started by self-proclaimed Marxist socialist. Coleman, do you believe that Marxist socialism is an ally for Blacks or not? If we're talking about, Blacks wanted to elevate themselves to everybody else's level.
Oh, no, not at all. I mean, there's we have about 100 years of evidence on how well Marxism works in terms of lifting up the poor. And it's one of the most conclusive, straightforward, open and shut cases of social science and economics that exists. It's never worked anywhere. So the people that remain Marxist or communist to this day, like, you know, Patrice Cullors, the trained Marxist or whatever. I don't exactly know what the training is to become a Marxist, but that's what she calls herself. This is just ideology. These are people that are indoctrinated and have not really thought deeply or accurately about the history of economics, and we should not let them drag anyone down with them. Although they don't behave like Marxists. I mean, no, she famously, embezzled millions of dollars in donations from Black Lives Matter and paid $1 million to her baby daddy, $1 million to her brother, bought a $6 million mansion. So not very Marxisty.
But it's typical of them, but we all know that they love money no matter what. Coleman, going back to when you were talking about ideologies, a lot of the critical theory thing and is based on this very simple process of thinking on one side oppressed, on one side oppressors. And when you look at the world with that very, with those only two lenses, we can end up in very bad places. And so there's something that's going on today. I'm sure, when I look at US campuses and what's going on, especially with the conflict between, Israel and Palestine. And I should say, I always go back to governments. I don't mix people too much into things. So between, the government of Netanyahu as well as the Gaza government, all the way thousands of miles away from where it's happening, you have on US campuses across the country as of today, kids, people fighting with each other. And it seems to me like it's all along the lines of, here we have a perceived oppressed, here we have a perceived oppressor, and you have it. What's your take on what's going on right now? And do you think if you were involved and at the table of where we can try to solve this, what would be your proposed solution, or at least direction in which to look?
Yeah, so I think most students in America, places like Columbia and so forth, they care about the Israel-Palestine issue, mostly not because they're anti-Semites, but because they think it's a situation of a colonizer and a colonized people. And so just like a lot of people criticized apartheid South Africa, that's what they believe is the relationship between Israel and the Israelis and the Palestinians. In reality, the situation with the Israelis and the Palestinians is very different, and much more complicated, and not nearly as easy as oppressor versus oppressed, in my view. But the truth is, most of the kids protesting don't know very much. They know what they think they know from Instagram posts, maybe an article or two. The majority of them have never read a full book about the Israel-Palestine conflict or taken a class on it. And if they have, it's probably a very slanted class given the bias of universities. So it's not a deeply informed position. It's just like a gut reaction to what has been sold to them as a straightforward injustice. What to do about that? Well, my view is that college protesters should be able to say almost whatever they want. I believe in free speech. And so I think they should even be able to chant from the river to the sea if they want to. But what they can't do is what I've seen videos of, where you have an encampment of people that have taken over a zone of campus, and they form a human chain to not allow in Zionists to that part of campus. I don't think that's I don't think that's okay. Like, you couldn't do that with any other political identity. Like, okay, we're going to take over the lawn here and no Republicans allowed or no Democrats allowed. Like, you can't do that. So to the extent they're doing that, I do think they need to be cleared out. To the extent that they are just protesting with slogans and not harassing individual students, like getting up in students' faces or following students or anything like that. If they're not doing that, then I think they should be allowed to protest, even if I disagree with the underlying, their underlying
And
claims.
talking about the claims, what's your take on the conflict itself? And what do you feel could be the path to resolution?
I don't think that there is a resolution. I think the resolution opportunities have been missed. In 2000 and 2008, there were two-state solutions on the table, deals on the table. In 2000, in particular, with the Clinton parameters, the Palestinians would have gotten 97% of the West Bank, sovereignty over the holy sites of Islam in Jerusalem, and in exchange, and Israel would have gotten peace. And Arafat said no to that, because the crux of the conflict is that what Palestinians want most, in particular Palestinian leaders, what they want most is for Israel to be gone. And that's not true on the Israeli side. Israelis historically want more than anything peace. They want no more terrorism. They want to do anything to stop the terrorism. Now, there are religious Jews that want the West Bank for themselves and so forth, and that contingent has been growing. But fundamentally, Israelis want peace the most. Palestinians, the whole Palestinian national identity formed in the early 20th century in reaction to Jews migrating to the region. And it literally, there was no such thing as a Palestinian identity in 1850, right? You were Arab, you were from your clan or something like that. The unique Palestinian identity formed in opposition to Jewish migration to the region. And so no Palestinian leader has been able to even admit that the Jews used to have a kingdom there, that the Jews built a temple there, that the Jews have any claim to that land, any legitimate claim. From the Palestinian perspective, the Jews are simply colonizers that came from Europe, the same way that the British came to South Africa. And so why would they compromise? Why would they give Jews a single inch? And that's been the Palestinian perspective since 1947, essentially. And that's what has prevented a compromise, is that Palestinians don't want a two-state solution. At least not enough of them want a two-state solution as an end to the conflict forever. And so everyone in the West loves to talk about solutions because we think there should be a solution, right? From our perspective as Westerners, what we value is we want Israel and Palestine to be like America and Canada. We just want people to stop dying on all sides and everyone to go on with the project of building happy countries and living according to, but Palestinian leaders care more for their own reasons about ejecting Israel. It's a fundamental insult and humiliation that the state of Israel exists there. And so that's what they want. And so it means nothing for us to say from afar, oh, well, there should be a solution. Well, these two parties want fundamentally different things. And so there's not going to be a solution until something changes fundamentally. As for October 7th and Israel's response, I think that Israel had to go in after October 7th and get rid of Hamas. I think the suffering and civilian casualties and humanitarian catastrophe is an absolute tragedy. But it is Israel nevertheless has a responsibility to get rid of Hamas at this point. You can't live with a terrorist group on your border that is sworn to your destruction, does not want a two-state solution at all, wants to go house to house, burning families alive. I mean, it's completely unacceptable.
Yeah. So going back now, this would be my last question for you, Coleman, today. Do you believe that there's a role for Black Africans in Africa to play in the perception of Blacks in general in the world, and especially as it relates to this thing called racism? Do you believe that there's a role for for us in Africa, because Africa is home to 90% of our representatives of those of us with black skin color. So do you think that there is a role for us to play in changing the perception of race for those who have them around the world?
It's a good question. I mean, personally, I love the mentality of African immigrants to America who I'm familiar with, and to the UK. I think that immigration has been a vital and had a positive effect, and both on the immigrants themselves and on the country. As you pointed out, I hope that the African immigrant mentality can advertise the possibility of a different mental relationship for Black Americans towards race and towards the country. So to the extent that African immigrants can be an example of how to think more constructively and positively about America.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Any last thoughts or something you wanted to touch upon but we did not touch upon?
No, I think that's pretty much it. Buy my book, The End of Race Politics, for more. Follow me on Twitter.
All right. Coleman, this was such a pleasure. I just love how cool-headed you are about everything. We need this behavior in these times. So thank you.
Thank you.